Hello everyone, welcome to the channel and the video. I am GM Spectre. I'm a game design student with Full Sail University, working on my bachelor's degree currently in game design. I'm going to be analyzing today the Magic the Gathering Fallout series Precon deck, the Wise Mothman. I'm going to be looking at it out of the box, looking at some analytics and percentages and numbers on how it's composed, how it works, what the build up of it is, and then go through card by card and talk about what each card does, what its role is, what its function is, how effective it is. Um, and then when in the future, we'll be doing some videos on how to upgrade it, different things that we can do with it, and I'm going to upgrade my copy of the Mothman using extra cards from my own collection. We'll turn it into something a little bit different than it originally started as. But with no further ado, let's jump right into it. So overall, I was very impressed with this deck. For some of the other precons that I've played haven't been very good, or they haven't measured up to what I was expecting of them. This one, going in, I was pretty excited. I wasn't sure entirely what to expect. I played 4 games with it and won all 4 of them. One of them was pretty close. The other 2 were fairly handy. But the thing about this deck that I noticed is that it's really fun to play. It's got a lot of internal synergies with itself. It plays like a tribal deck, but it also plays like a themed deck. So a lot of times you get tribal decks that are sort of copy paste. You know, you get all the tribal artifacts where creatures you control the chosen type get blah 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 blah. It had a little bit of that, but it also played like it had a designated function, which was rad counters, mill, and 1/1 counters, which all loop into each other very, very well. The deck overall played and felt really smooth. It had a nice land ramp scenario. I didn't feel like I was really lacking for any lands. Definitely would recommend this deck as either a starter for modifying it to build your own, or even just playing it out the box as is. I could see this deck doing very well at tournaments. It is more efficient in multiplayer games. I would expect and predict, but just really fun deck. Had a lot of fun digging into it, analyzing it, taking it apart. Um, and I will let you know here after we get into the meat of what the deck is and how it does and what it does, and go through the analytics. I'll tell you what my overall verdict is going to be on it, whether I'm going to scrap it or keep it or as is or heavily modify it, rebuild it, what my plans are for it. And then we will see you next time and call it a night. But for now, what we're going to do is let's just go ahead and take a look at the commander, which is always the first step in the process, and kind of digging into how it works, what it can do, what it can't do, how it's technically worded, and then we'll go from there. Alright, so taking a look at this commander, we have the Wise Mothman right here. He's a 4-cost black, green, blue commander, 3/3 insect mutant with flying as its base. So it's a nice low cost, 4 cost with the CMC there. That's good. The lower your CMC is on your commander, the more likely you are to be able to get him out reliably, and the more of a integral role in your deck he can generally play. Again, that's not necessarily as a rule. If you have run in a deck that's really good with mana ramp, you shouldn't need to worry about that. But its abilities. Whenever the Wise Mothman enters the battlefield or attacks, each player gets a rad counter. Couple of things going on here. So we're dealing with an attack trigger whenever it enters the battlefield or attacks. So it's got ETB, it's got attack. Each player gets a rad counter at that point. So we got ETB, attack trigger, and rad counters. So what exactly are rad counters? I haven't seen them anywhere else outside of Fallout. Oh no, there's some weird new mechanic that's crazy and complicated. Well, it really isn't. All radiation counters do is at the beginning of your pre-combat main phase, if you have any rad counters, you mill that many cards, and for each non-land card milled this way, you lose 1 life and you remove 1 rad counter from yourself. So a misconception that can happen is sometimes people will think that you lose 1 life and then at the end after that you remove a rad counter. I myself thought that for quite a while. It is in fact for every non-land card that you mill this way, you lose 1 life and a rad counter. So you remove a rad counter whenever you mill a non-land card as well. So that is important to note. So what this deck is essentially doing so far, what the commander does, is whenever he attacks, all of your opponents get this, so that at the beginning of their pre-combat main phase, they mill 1 card, and if that card is non-land, they lose a life, and then the rad counter goes away. If it is a land card, they don't lose a life, but they keep the rad counter. And so, say you attack at your next turn, then they'll have 2 rad counters. So at the beginning of their pre-combat main phase, they will mill 2 cards. And for each non-land card milled that way, they will lose 1 life and then remove a rad counter. You know what I mean? Or that many rad counters. So, can build up, and if it doesn't pay off immediately, that's fine. That just means that you'll keep milling your opponents out, and those rad counters will keep building and stacking. But if you happen to hit a whole bunch of non-lands, those rad counters can disappear again pretty quick. So you're going to want to build those up using other cards in the deck. But Mothman has a secondary ability here. Whenever 1 or more non-land cards are milled, put a 1/1 counter on each of up to X target creatures, where X is the number of non-land cards milled this way. Okay. Now things get interesting. So we got these rad counters rolling, right? Let's say you're playing a 4-player game, right? You got these rad counters rolling. You are also building up these rad counters, so you also are dealing with this too. And it says whenever 1 or more non-land cards are milled, period. It doesn't specify opponents, it doesn't specify yours. Whenever 1 or more non-land cards are milled, well, it's comma, but fight me about it. Put a 1/1 counter on each of up to X target creatures, where X is the number of non-land cards milled this way. So what this does, in effect, is you play your commander, everybody gets a rad counter. As it enters the battlefield, you pass turn. Goes to your opponent, your first opponent's turn. They're going to mill a card up. It's a non-land card. You're going to put, it's 1, the card that's non-land card that's being milled. So you're going to put a 1/1 counter on each of up to 1 target creatures. So you put 1/1 counter on Mothman, or whatever creature you want, right? Boom, there you go. Now it's going to be the next opponent's. Oh, he also lost a life too. So now it's going to be the next opponent's turn. They're going to they mill a land card. Well, great. They keep their rad counter for next time, right? Next opponent's turn. Okay, he mills a card, and now, oh no, it's a non-land card. So they lose a life, they lose a rad counter, you put another 1/1 counter on up to 1 target creature. Okay? So it kind of ends up building up in that sort of a way. Now if let's say you get to an opponent that has 5 rad counters and they mill 5 non-land cards. This ability would resolve whenever 1 or more non-land cards are milled. Put a 1/1 counter on each of up to X target creature. So you would put a 1/1 counter on 5 different creatures that you control. Now, that's kind of a lot, but there's a little bit more that we need to break down and analyze here. Whenever 1 or more non-land cards are milled. So this runs on instance of mill. So with rad counters, this is only triggering once on each player's turn. If you're milling by rad counters, that is only triggering once on each player's turn. So the more players that you're playing with that have rad counters, the more instances of building up and putting 1/1 counters you're going to end up having. So Mothman is going to be more effective in multiplayer decks or multiplayer games, and still very effective, but not as effective in 1v1s. I've played it in 1v1s. I haven't played it in multiplayers yet. But that instance of mill is important, because if you have another card, for example, that just causes your opponents, you tap it and your opponents mill a card, that is an instance of mill whenever one or more non-land cards. So that would trigger once, you know? Um, so instance of mill is going to be very important in this deck too. So that's kind of how the commander works. Let's go ahead and look at the actual deck itself as far as the analytics go. Let's crunch some numbers. I made a spreadsheet that, well, I'll show you what it does here in just a second, but it can really help break down how decks are set up and how they work, and help you see and visualize what exactly your deck composition is. So let's go ahead and jump into that, and then after that we will come back to the table and we'll look at the individual cards that make up this deck. All right, let's really quickly hop into these deck analytics. This is a a spreadsheet of my own design that calculates all the likelihoods and the percentages and how many of each type of thing we got in the deck, and inputs all of the different cards in the deck, and it's very helpful for plotting out and charting out and seeing exactly how the deck works and interacts with itself, and what those numbers actually end up being. I'm still tweaking the calculations on the percentages, so for now we'll ignore those and we'll just look at these numbers up the top. So 100 cards in the deck, total CMC of 220 with the average of 3.61. So 3.61 average converted mana cost is a little higher on the converted mana cost if you're looking for a good, solid, nice, fast, quick, reliable deck. Depending on your mana ramp situation, obviously, but I usually tend to shoot for somewhere between 2 and 3. Um, does that end up happening always? No. Is that a requirement? No. I've seen plenty of decks with a higher CMC that are able to get there quickly, and so that just isn't even an issue for them. So it depends on the deck, really. For this deck, I would try and lower it a little bit, but that's not necessary. So, got 7 instants, 7 sorceries, 29 creatures, 11 artifacts, and 8 enchantments. Now, notice that some of them are doubled up, so enchantment creatures are marked as both enchantments and creatures. So that's just something to keep in mind when looking at the numbers. We've got 39 lands, 19 of which produce blue mana, black mana, 15 of which produce green mana, and 17 of which produce blue mana, 6 of which produce colorless. Now, 19 plus 15 plus 17 plus 6 does not 39 make, but that's just because dual lands are marked as both. So, for example, we got probably our command tower, Path of Ancestry right here, marked as black, green, and blue, because that is what it can produce. And so that's why these numbers are kind of all wonky here. So as far as color identity goes, now these are the number of cards that are considered part of these color identities. So we've got black, green, blue in this particular Mothman deck. So we got 21 black cards, 34 green cards, 17 blue cards, and 9 that are exclusively colorless. So these also are counting. So this 21 includes all of the black, green, and black, blue cards. This 34 includes all of the green, black, and green, blue, so on and so forth. So fairly even color spread, primarily a green deck with a little bit of black and then blue thrown in as the backup. Now, if we look over back here at the land balance, we see that there's 15 lands that produce green, 19 lands that produce black, and 17 lands that produce blue. So the really interesting thing about this is that normally you would think that you would emphasize having green lands in your deck so that you could reliably have the color that you need most. But this setup focuses more on production of black mana, which is really interesting that they did that. If I were to, and I will be in future videos, um, going to dive into improving this land balance, I would consider at least swapping the black and the green color ratios so that you have 19 green and 15 black. But we'll see about that. We'll get into that later. But this is why part of why the spreadsheet is helpful is because you can kind of look at and see what the actual ratios are. Moving on down the spreadsheet, color ratio. So what the color ratio is it's a more specific way of calculating identity. So what color ratio does is that calculates all and records all of the instances of that color of mana in the casting cost of each card. So for example, if a card has has 2 black, it records 2, right? If it this cost in particular, right? This card here is a black black green green card, right? That it costs 2 black and 2 green in order to cast it. And so in here it counts it at each one of those as 2, whereas over here it counts it as 1. And so this is just the number of cards, whereas this is the actual balance of what you need to cast in your deck. So looking at this, we got 41 green, 26 black, and 18 blue. So you can still see it's kind of a similar pattern as over here. We have green is even more in the lead than it is with the base color identity. Black has a couple more, and blue is still pretty much exactly where it is. But if you think about the ratios, you know, between the mana that you're actually going to need in order to run this deck effectively, you are going to need that much more green more consistently than you are black, and you're producing more black than you are green if you from your land balance here. So these are all different things and aspects that you want to be considering as you're building or examining a precon or building your own deck from scratch or however it is. Um, so this is just kind of going over it generally. So ramp over here, it also, the spreadsheet next calculates and determines how much of each kind of card you have in the deck. So this is mostly up for interpretation. With every deck that I run, I have a specific set of 5 categories that I will use. I will always use um, sorry, there we go. Get that better. So I will always use ramp, draw, control, survivability, and utility. Those are just always there. Um, because every deck that you're going to build and you're going to encounter, you're going to run, you're going to want some way to draw more cards. You're going to want some way to ramp yourself up to your higher costs faster. You're going to want some measure of the ability to control your opponent's board states to prevent yourself from ending up in an untenable situation. And you want survivability cards to protect you. Utility I just use as a general catch-all, like if it is kind of tangentially related, but it's a very useful card in the context of this deck, I'll throw it under utility. And then I use 3, 4, occasionally 5, but I try to limit it to 3 or 4 other main aspects of the deck, like things that the deck does that distinguish it from other decks. For example, this Mothman deck, right, as we were discussing earlier, it puts rad counters on players and it puts 1/1 counters on creatures. So that's its main focus is rad counters and 1/1 counters. And by rad counters, it extends into mill functionality and things. So rad counters, S is rad counters on oneself because this deck will do both. Some cards will put it on your opponent, some cards will put it on you, and that is an important thing to distinguish. And then so rad counters on self, rad counters on opponents right here, and then 1/1 cards that deal with 1/1 counters. So as you can see, there are 12 cards in this deck that involve putting rad counters exclusively on yourself. And there are 14 cards that involve putting 1/1 counters or rad counters on your opponents. Some cards, like Mothman, as we discussed, will put them on all players. So that is marked as being under both categories. So that's something to consider in here as well. So this just kind of gives us an idea. This deck mostly places rad counters on your opponents, but it's a close call. It's not necessarily overwhelmingly putting them on your opponents. It does put them on yourself, um, almost equal measures. So this is all just things to keep in mind as we move forward. Now that we've kind of looked at the numbers a little bit, kind of gone over mana balance and things like that, let's go ahead and dive into the actual deck list and see what that looks like, what each of the cards individually does, and then we'll go from there. All right, back to the table. Going through the deck here. First card, Marcus Mutant Mayor is a 5-cost 4/4 Vigilance Trample with whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to a player, draw a card if that creature has a 1/1 counter on it. If it doesn't, put a 1/1 counter on it. Okay, so here we're laying 1/1 counters. We're drawing cards, creatures that already have 1/1 counters if they get through when they attack. Specifically combat damage, not non-combat damage. For a 5-cost, okay, that's not a terrible choice. I would try and normally reduce that card draw CMC down, but it doubles with as a 1/1 counter dropper. So I think overall pretty solid option and choice in the deck here. The next card, the Master Transcendent, is a 4-cost black, green, blue 2/4 legendary artifact creature, also mutant. When the Master Transcendent enters the battlefield, target player gets 2 rad counters. So it'll put rad counters target player, so it's either your opponents or yourself, up to you. And tap it to put target creature card in a graveyard, not specifically yours, a graveyard that was milled this turn onto the battlefield under your control. It is a green mutant with base power and toughness 3/3. It loses all other colors and creature types. So, this hits all graveyards. It transforms it into a mutant, which this deck does have a little bit of tribal for mutants and zombies. So these creatures will benefit from that. And also notice it's not until the Master Transcendent leaves the battlefield. A lot of these gain control of target creatures are like until this card leaves the battlefield or whatever. So the Master Transcendent is not like that. So every time you tap him, you're just bouncing something back from the graveyard onto the battlefield. Not into your hand even, straight up onto the battlefield. So this can be a really helpful creature. It gets around CMC, allow you to bring your own stuff from your graveyard, your opponent's stuff from the graveyard. Fantastic all-around card. We're going to hit Vault 12, the Necropolis. It's a 6-cost black Saga. Sagas, when they enter the battlefield, after your draw step, you add a lore counter, and then you sacrifice it after it gets its third counter, and that ability resolves. So it's getting into the battlefield. Each player gets 3 rad counters. And then that's phase 1. And then on your next turn, you're going to create X22 black zombie mutant creature tokens. So there's zombie mutants again. Where X is the total number of rad counters among players. So if you and your opponents have all kinds of rad counters on it, then you get a whole bunch of zombies. And on the follow-up turn, you're going to put 2 1/1 counters on each creature you control that is a zombie or a mutant. So you're going to give rad counters, which will then, on your next turn, give more zombies, which will then, on your next turn, gain 1/1 counters. And notice that also hits all creatures you control that's a zombie or a mutant. Now, there's a lot of mutants and zombies in this deck. That's part of what this deck is it's a tribal deck, which is pretty interesting that it's both tribal and it also has this rad counter focus. Gives it a little bit of an extra edge there. Mirelurk Queen is a 5-cost 4/4 with vigilance. When it enters the battlefield, target player gets 2 rad counters. Again, target player, not specifically you. So it'll help hit your opponents, it'll help hit you. However you feel like those need to be distributed in this moment. And then put a +1/+1 counter on Mirelurk Queen. I skipped a whole bunch there. So, sorry. When it enters the battlefield, target player gets 2 rad counters. Then, whenever one or more non-land cards are milled, you draw a card, and then put a +1/+1 counter on Mirelurk Queen. Sorry, my brain got way ahead of me there. So, as turn order is going around, right, and people are milling and you're putting 1/1 counters with Wise Mothman, you're also putting an extra 1/1 counter specifically on Mirelurk Queen and drawing a card. This ability triggers only once each turn. So it's one or more non-land cards. So it's you don't get any extra benefit for more than one non-land card. It's just in an instance of non-land cards being milled, the first time that, or not even the first time that happens. Yeah, it is the first time that happens on each turn, because it doesn't say may, so you don't get to choose when it resolves. It's whenever one or more non-land cards are milled, draw a card, and then put a 1/1 counter on Mirelurk Queen. This ability triggers only once each turn. So, once every turn this happens, get a card draw, get an extra 1/1 counter on Mirelurk. If you mill hit non-lands, which is great. Harmonize. We got a 4-cost green sorcery of draw 3 cards. It's pretty decent. A lot of times, outright card draw instants and sorceries, their mana cost to number of cards drawn is usually 1 extra mana per card, or then there are cards being drawn. That's the average. The good ones are cheaper. This one is okay, simply because if you do the math and you think about it, paying 3 to draw 2 cards versus paying 4 to draw 3 cards, you're expending less mana per card that you're drawing. So Harmonize would be better than some of the other lower cost blue cards, but it is a 4-cost, so that's something to keep in mind as you're going through this. Moving forward, we got a 3-cost Tireless Tracker that is a 3/2 with a landfall ability. Of whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you're going to investigate, which causes you to, as some of you will know, put a clue token onto the battlefield. That is an artifact with pay 2 and sacrifice this artifact to draw a card. So, clues tend, remember I was saying, you pay 2 to draw 1 card, right? Card draw being generally 1 more extra mana than cards that you're drawing. But you also have to trigger this to get that clue token to drop. Then you're paying 2 and sacrificing the artifact to draw a card. Investigate can be a little bit messy sometimes. Now, that being said, while I prefer not to rely on Investigate for my card draw, other people might disagree. I know that I have seen Investigate used very, very effectively. My personal preference, though, I tend to prefer more immediate yield card draw. So where I draw either more in bulk, or it's something that my hand is running out. Boom, here we go. Now I have a full hand again, or repeatable, or things like that. Paying 2 to draw a single card, that's pretty darn expensive. It's like we were saying, paying 4 to draw 3, or even paying 3 to draw 2. The mana per card being drawn ratio is still so much more efficient if you're with the higher card draw than it is with the lower card draw. So paying 2 to draw 1, it's pretty mana steep in my opinion. Also sacrificing the artifact if you're running an artifact sack deck, great, extra synergy. The interesting thing about this Tireless Tracker, though, is its secondary ability. Whenever you sacrifice a clue, put a 1/1 counter on Tireless Tracker. So it does have a little bit of extra synergy with the Mothman in that it puts more 1/1 counters on itself. I would probably personally, just as again, personal preference, pull that out, replace it with something with a more cost-effective card draw utility. because this deck doesn't really do anything with artifact sacrifice or directly drawing cards or instance of drawing cards. So not being able to synergize with that, I would probably replace Tireless Tracker with something a little bit more efficient. Next card, we got Piper Wright, Public Reporter. It's a 2-cost 1/2. Whenever it deals combat damage to a player, investigate that many times. So more clue tokens, more card draw. Whenever you sacrifice a clue, you put a 1/1 counter on target creature you control. So this is basically, if you think about it, almost exactly the same as Tireless Tracker, except for it's not a landfall ability. It triggers on whenever it deals combat damage, so it has to attack and get through. So this one is more likely to trigger, but when this triggers, you still get your clue token, but whenever you sacrifice a clue, put a 1/1 counter on target creature you control instead of specifically on Tireless Tracker. This one's also a 2-cost, and the power toughness ratios are a little bit different, this one being a little bit more aggressive than Piper is. Now, that being said, when you sacrifice a clue, would apply both at the same time. So that doesn't really affect, or the likelihood that Piper drops a clue token versus Tireless Tracker drops a clue token doesn't really matter because both will trigger whenever you sacrifice a clue token. So I would still kind of lump Piper in with the Tireless Tracker, where I would put in a more effective, more efficient form of card draw. Especially because those are really the only 2 cards that synergize with sacrificing a clue token. So I would go with a more effective route. Here's our Strength Bobblehead, 3-cost tap, add 1 mana of any color. So we got a 3-cost mana rock, solid. That has pay 3 and tap, put X 1/1 counters on target creature, where X is the number of bobbleheads you control. Activate only as a sorcery. So bobbleheads can be fun. The problem with bobbleheads is that there are only 2 in this precon. There are only 2 in this precon, so as this is set up, it's pay 3 and tap to put a maximum of 2 1/1 counters on target creature, where X is the number of bobbleheads you control, which is a maximum of 2. So it's pay 3 to put 2 1/1 counters on target creature. More likely, pay 3 to put 1 1/1 counter on target creature. Its secondary ability, not super helpful. It does help you with mana balance in the tricolor, but I think we can find something that is more effective or cheaper or something like that, and be able to pull this bobblehead out and maybe include it in an artifact deck with other bobbleheads from other decks. So I think overall, probably not the best, mechanically speaking, the best card to have in this deck. Moving on to Contagion Clasp. It's a 2-cost artifact. When it enters the battlefield, put a -1/-1 counter on target creature. It can be target creature, not target creature you control, so that doesn't have to go on you. Pay 4 and tap to proliferate. So you choose any number of permanents and or players and give each of them another counter of each kind they already have. So that's interesting to think about because you got -1/-1 counters, you got rad counters, and you got +1/+1 counters. Now it's not, you don't choose what counters to double. You choose the entities and then you put another of each type of counter that entity has on them. So if a player has an infect counter, but they also have an experience counter, if you choose them, then you would put both an infect counter and a experience counter on that player. So can be a good thing, can be a bad thing on with Proliferate. Situational. The fact that you're throwing around so many more counters than is likely your opponent is. It's a decent card, but paying 4 and tapping to proliferate, there's a lot of other cards in this deck that you can proliferate for 3 or even 2 sometimes. So I would say probably not the best card to keep in the deck, but dealer's choice. Moving forward, Lily Bowen, Raging Grandma, is a 4-cost 0/0 with Vigilance. When it enters the battlefield, or it enters the battlefield with 2 1/1 counters on it. At the beginning of your upkeep, double the number of 1/1 counters on Lily Bowen if its power is 16 or less. Otherwise, remove all but one 1/1 counter from it and then you gain 1 life for each 1/1 counter removed this way. So this creature will hit a maximum of being a 32/32, and then on your next upkeep, you will gain 31 life, and it will go back to being a 1/1. So that's a very interesting thing to think about. It's a very dynamic card, depending on where it is in its phase. It'll start with 2, and then it'll go 4, 6, or sorry, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 1. And then it'll go 1, and then it'll go 2, and then it'll go 4, and then it'll go 8, 16, 32, right? And so on and so forth. So every 5 or 6 odd turns, you'll be gaining 31 life, and you'll have a massive creature that builds fairly quickly in the meantime. Synergy with Mothman, just 1/1 counters, a little bit of life gain utility. I think for a 4 cost, I think we could have probably found a better card that would synergize with Mothman a little bit better. Moving on to Talisman of Curiosity, which is a 2 cost, tap, add colorless, or tap, add green or blue, and it deals 1 damage to you. Talismans, I can like and respect talismans. I tend to not prefer them due to the dealing of 1 damage to you. But in tricolor decks, it definitely helps with making sure that you get the mana balance that you need efficiently. So in a tricolor deck, I would say leave talismans in. If you're running a dual color deck, you probably can find a better mana rock than a talisman, because you won't really be so thinly spread on your color balances, as we saw in the analysis spreadsheets here. Hancock Ghoulish Mare is a 3 cost 2/1 legendary mutant advisor zombie. So there's zombie mutants again. Almost the whole deck. Zombie mutant, zombie mutant, zombie mutant. Each other creature you control that's a zombie or mutant, go figure, gets +X/+X, where X is the number of counters on Hancock Ghoulish Mare. It has Undying, so whenever it dies, whenever it dies with no 1/1 counters on it, it comes back to the battlefield with a 1/1 counter. This is a great card. Kind of. What I mean by that is other creatures get +X/+X, where X is the number of counters on Hancock. If Hancock has 1/1 counters, it dies, it doesn't come back, Undying becomes irrelevant. But if it dies and then it comes back, zombie or mutant creatures you control get +1/+1, and then you load him up with counters, and he can be absolutely a beast. But you could also just use Mothman to load him up and skip the Undying trigger altogether, and cause your zombies or mutants to be beasts. So Hancock overall, solid card, a little bit, in my opinion, kind of cyclical by the fact that it has both Undying and this other ability. So I don't know. I just find that that's really weird from a game design standpoint, but to each their own. Definitely a card that's solid in this deck the way that it is set up. Alpha Deathclaw, 4 cost 6/6 Menace Trample. When it enters the battlefield or becomes monstrous, destroy target permanent. It's got a monstrosity 4 of 7 cost. So you pay 6, enters the battlefield, destroy target permanent. You have a 6/6 Menace Trample. And then at any point you can pay 7, put 4 1/1 counters on it, which has some deck synergy right there. And it'll become a 10/10, and then you can also destroy target permanent again. I can see it. Because you can also make it bigger, and having Menace with Mothman, and then having Menace Trample. Menace, it can only be blocked by 2 or more creatures. Trample, everything carries through. Yeah, I can see that. The only thing that I'm hesitant about is a 7 cost Monstrosity 4. But which is basically like a sorcery that you can play that puts 4/1/1 counters on it and allows you to destroy target permanent as a 7 cost. To be fair, in Garruk's Wake is a 7 cost board wipe. But this is destroy or opponent board wipe. But this destroys target permanent. I don't know. Mixed feelings about it. It's pretty high on the CMC scale overall, but it is also pretty effective. I see its place in the deck. I don't know if it would be my choice to include it, but I understand why it is put in this particular deck. Recon Craft Theta is a 4-cost 4/4 flying vehicle, so it is not a creature unless you pay its crew cost, which is 2. And how to pay crew costs, for those of you that don't know, is if you tap a creature that has power 2 or greater, or a number of creatures equal to, with power equal to 2 or greater, then this becomes a creature. Now, you can tap 2 1/1 creatures to pay that cost, or you can tap 1 4/4 creature to pay that cost. Whatever the case is, that's how crew generally works. At that point, it becomes a creature. It has flying, and when it enters the battlefield, you create a 0/0 blue alien creature token with a 1/1 counter on it, so there's some 1/1 counter synergy there. Whenever Recon Craft Theta attacks, proliferate. So that's a nice, easy way of getting that proliferate trigger off. A lot easier than the paying for the bobblehead or for the contagion clasp. So solid card to have in here, very solid. You just got to be careful with what you choose to proliferate. But yeah, no, totally understand it for this deck. Strong, the Brutish Thespian. We got a 6-cost 7/7 with Ward 2. Ward 2, that's good for that protection. When Strong is dealt damage, you get 3 rad counters and put a 1/1 counter and put 3 1/1 counters on Strong. And then you gain life rather than lose life from radiation. Okay, so this is very key. This is very key. This ability right here. You gain life rather than lose life from radiation. So if you recall, radiation, right? Whenever you mill a non-land card due to rad counters, you lose a life. Well, this prevents that. And instead of losing life, it changes to you gain 1 life for you specifically. Your opponents will still lose life, but you will gain life instead. So you're able to give yourself a bit of regeneration through self-mill. Very effective. Very solid. It's a 6-cost, but it is 7/7 with Ward 2, so it's easy to protect itself. Whenever it's dealt damage, rad counters, and it gets bigger. Overall, I'd say this is a fantastic card for the way that this deck is set up. Talisman of Dominance. I already kind of went over Talismans. Great for tricolor decks. Less so for bicolor decks. In this context, we got a tricolor deck. Solid fit. Young Deathclaws. We got a 4-cost 4/2 with Menace. Each creature card in your graveyard has Scavenge. The Scavenge cost is equal to its mana cost. Exile. So Scavenge works. Exile a creature card from your graveyard and pay its mana cost. Put a number of 1/1 counters equal to that card's power onto target creature. Scavenge only as a sorcery. So while this is out, you can essentially cast a creature from your graveyard to exile, pay its mana cost, put it into exile, and whatever that creature's power is, you put that many number of 1/1 counters on a target creature. So with self-mill, that allows you to get some graveyard utility out, converts that into 1/1 counters. Pretty solid, pretty solid. 4-cost Rad Storm. So it's a 4-cost instant with proliferate. So you pay 4 to proliferate. Very similar to the bobblehead. But it also has Storm, which when you cast a spell, copy it for each spell cast before it this turn. So this is most effectively played on your opponent's turn. because then you don't have to pay all the mana cost for all these other spells. Right? You see that? Because if you play this on your turn, this is part of why this is an instant. If you play this on your turn, then you have to cast a whole bunch of other spells before it in order to make this card worth it. Because paying 4 to proliferate, again, we can pay 3, pay 2 to proliferate in this deck. Pay 0 to proliferate. We saw the Recon Craft Theta. We attack and we proliferate, you know? But with this Storm, if you have an opponent that plays 4 1-cost spells or whatever, you can play Rad Storm and then proliferate 4 times for 4 mana. So, solid card to have in this deck. Just make sure that when you play it, you use it properly. And that your timing on when you play that card will determine whether or not that card is mana efficient or if it's mana pathetic. So that's just something to keep in mind. Watchful Radstag, we got a 3-cost 2/2 with Evolve whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control. If that creature has a greater power or toughness than this creature, put a 1/1 counter on this creature. So if I were to then play we'll say, one of these onto the battlefield, it has a greater power and toughness than this creature. So we're going to put a 1/1 counter on this creature. So Watchful Radstag gets a 1/1 counter because this enters the battlefield. Now, whenever Watchful Radstag evolves, so whenever you put a 1/1 counter on this as a result of this ability, create a token that's a copy of it. So put a counter on this, and then this duplicates. And now you have 2 of them that work the same way. And then you both of those will duplicate, and so on and so forth. So this is a pretty good self-replication card. If you have a deck that has a solid number of larger creatures in it. Excuse me. Alright, next card. We got that Lumbering Mega Sloth again. It's a 12-cost 8/8. Boom. I remember how I pointed out how that CMC was a bit higher than I would normally like. 12 cost. This card right here is probably a big part of why. This spell costs 1 less to cast for each counter among players and permanents. Okay, so it is a 10 cost technically speaking, and the spreadsheet will show it as a 10 cost. But that cost reduction there, especially with the synergy of the Mothman, we're able to put counters on absolutely everything. It can be a pretty cheap 8/8 trample that enters the battlefield tapped. So while this is good synergy, this doesn't do you any good. This doesn't really do you any good. And this does you a little bit of good, but kind of not really, because this deck doesn't really focus on supermassive creatures at the moment. We've got a couple of them that we can build up with the 1/1 counters, and if we put 1/1 counters on creatures often enough, yeah, we can build these creatures up pretty solidly big. But the focus of those decks, of those cards, is not by necessity having big creatures. You know what I mean? Yes, combat damage is this deck's primary win condition. Combat damage or milling out the opponent. Mostly combat damage. But aside from that combat damage, this card contributes nothing to the deck and drives that CMC up. Because if, for example, say your opponents are like, oh, you're playing Mothman? Yeah, no, we're not going to let him touch the field. Right? And you aren't able to get your rad counters to stick and stay. For whatever reason. You've got to put this in your hand, and you've got a 12 cost. You know what I mean? So, grab bag, dealer's choice. When I rebuild this deck, I'll probably pull that out, replace it with something a little bit different. I'm also going to be, when I do that, I'm going to be refocusing this whole deck a little bit. But That's okay. I understand why the card is in here. It makes sense. Just maybe not the most synergetic card. Synergistic. Talisman. Already went over those. 3 cost, 2/2, Infesting Radroach. There's another mutant. 99% of these creatures are mutants, by the way. I've mentioned that many times. So we got Infesting Radroach can't block. It's a flying creature. Whenever it deals combat damage to a player, they get that many rad counters. Boom. Let's analyze that one for a second. So, whenever it deals combat damage to a player, they get that many rad counters. So if you put 1/1 counters on this dude, he deals combat damage, right? Your opponent's gonna get 2 rad counters, but then you build him up with 1/1 counters from Mothman, 3, 4, 5, 8, 12, 15, right? Hitting your opponents, adding all kinds of rad counters very, very, very quickly. And so that can be insanely beneficial. Now, whenever an opponent mills a non-land card, if infesting Radroach is in your graveyard, you may return it to your hand. So if you mill yourself out of this card, whenever an opponent mills a non-land card, you'll be like, oh, look, boom, it's back. So it's really easy to end up getting this card in your hand. If it dies, it comes back. If it gets milled, it comes back. You know, it's very resilient card. Fantastic addition to this deck. Definitely would not recommend removing it. It's just amazing. In the similar vein, we got a 3 cost 2/2 glowing one with Death Touch. Whenever glowing one deals combat damage to a player, they get 4 rad counters. Whenever a player mills a non-land card, you gain 1 life. So this functions almost similarly to Strong that we were talking about earlier, where whenever a player mills a non-land card, you gain 1 life. Well, with the way the rad counters work, whenever a player mills a non-land card, that player loses 1 life. So this, if you just have this, it just basically prevents you from losing this life. And then whenever your opponents lose this life, you gain that life. And so you get your life gain generation back on there. If you have this and Strong out, not only do you not lose this life, but you also gain this life. Because with this synergy, without Strong, you lose the life and then you gain the life right back. It's not that nothing actually happens, but you lose the life and then you gain the life right back. You know what I'm saying? So it kind of actually how it would work is you would gain the life and then lose the life, because you would mill. That mill would trigger this ability would resolve, and then you would continue through this ability. So you would mill, gain life, and then lose 1 life. So yeah, glowing one, fantastic again addition to this deck. Allows you to protect yourself from accidentally burning yourself out. Absolutely amazing. Fraying Sanity is a 3 cost Aura Curse enchantment. Enchant player at the beginning of each end step. Now this is not each of their end steps. This is each end step of all players. Enchanted player mills X cards, where X is the number of cards put into their graveyard from anywhere this turn. That can be very, very, very effective, because you can triggers on their end step, the other opponent's end steps, your end step, all of it. No, in any instance that you're able to get that player to mill cards, Fraying Sanity will then trigger at the end of that end step. And I've seen Fraying Sanity used to place a huge amount of cards in a graveyard. I've actually used that to mill about half of a remaining library once. Fantastic card in the right synergies and combinations. 4 cost Guardian Project enchantment. Whenever a non-token creature enters the battlefield under your control, if it doesn't have the same name as another creature you control or a creature card in your graveyard, draw a card. Folks, I'm going to point out one very important thing to you. One very, very, very important thing. We are playing Commander. In Commander, you only have 100 cards. And each of those cards is singleton. You can only have one of each card in your deck unless that card specifically states otherwise or it is a basic land. And so when playing this card in Commander, it roughly translates to, for the most part outside of very specific situations, whenever a non-token creature enters the battlefield under your control, draw a card. This is phenomenal. This is an amazing card that allows you to play creatures and draw, play creature and draw, play creature and draw. It's one of my favorite card draw cards in green. And it is 4 cost. Usually, like I said, remember I prefer my card draw to be lower. Well, this is a 4 cost that will potentially draw you 2 cards a turn. Indefinitely. So, totally worth the mana cost. 100% fantastic card. Glad it's in this deck. Cathedral Acolyte. 2 cost, 1/2. Each creature you control with a counter on it has Ward of 1. So here's one of those protection cards, right? So Ward means that whenever it becomes the target of a spell or ability an opponent controls, that a spell or ability is countered unless that player pays an additional 1 mana. This is pretty darn phenomenal. Gives you great protection. Forces your opponents to upcast things. For X costs that target multiple creatures, cost an additional 1 per creature to target. This can just be a super annoyance to your opponents. And it also has the secondary ability of tap, put a 1/1 counter on target creature that entered the battlefield this turn. Play a creature, tap this, 1/1 counter, word 1. There you go. Boom, done. And it also is immediately under the effect of any other spells or abilities you have that put 1/1 counters on target creatures, or that creatures you control with 1/1 counters on them gain this, or are this, or whatever. Which there are a solid number of them in this deck. So yeah, Cathedral Acolyte, phenomenal choice. Hardened Scales, so 1 cost enchantment. If 1 or more 1/1 counters would be put on a creature you control, that many +1 1/1 counters are put on it instead. This doubles the efficiency of this. And a whole bunch of other cards in this deck. That just, put a 1/1 counter on it in this situation. Put a 1/1 counter on it in this situation. Put a 1/1 counter on it in this situation. This essentially doubles all of those, because most of those are put a 1/1 counter. And so, if you think about it proportionately, sure, it just turns 1 counter into 2, but it also doubles the efficiency of those original abilities. Makes them twice as effective. For a 1 cost enchantment, that is fire, in my opinion. Hardened Scales, definitely almost a key card in this deck. 1000%. Coming to Nuke Launchers, a 2 cost equip 3 equipment that has equipped creature gets +3/+0 and has Intimidate. Okay, so it can't be blocked except by artifacts or creatures that share a type with a color with it. Okay, whenever equipped creature attacks, until the end of defending player's next turn, that player gets 2 rad counters whenever they cast a spell. Wow. That's protection. That's infliction. That's just pure sadism right there. That's, in Mothman, that's sadism. That's like, if you do anything, you're going to have, that's 2 more cards that you're going to have to mill. 2 more cards you're going to have to mill. 2 more cards you're going to have to mill. For every single time that defending player casts a spell until the end of their next turn. So they have to at least go through their own next turn. So yeah, no, that's a fantastic way to discourage players from doing as many things as possible. because then you can turn around and you weaponize those rad counters right back on them. Yeah. Nah, wow, I'm a huge fan. Love that card in this deck. Love that card in this deck. Ral Troubleshooter, 3 cost, 1/4. Once during each of your turns, you may cast a spell from among cards in your graveyard that were milled this turn. Each player mills a card when you tap it. So, 3 cost, tap ability. Each player mills a card. Now, each player milling a card. If that, remember what I was saying about when we were talking about Mothman? If each player mills a card, that would trigger whenever one or more non-land cards are milled for each player. So you tap this, and if he mills a non-land card, this triggers. If he mills a non-land card, this triggers. If he mills a non-land card, this triggers. If you mill a non-land card, this also triggers. 4 times off of tapping one creature. And once during each of your turns, you may cast a spell from among cards in your graveyard that were milled this turn. It's basically card draw. Sort of. It's like temporary sort of pseudo card draw. But it can be helpful, being my point. Amazing card. Amazing card in this deck. And it says cast a spell. It doesn't specify creature. It doesn't specify instant. It doesn't specify sorcery. A spell. Sorry. Amazing card. Alright. Nuclear Fallout. 2 cost X. Each creature gets twice -X until end of turn. And then each player gets X rad counters. So it's a pseudo board wipe. If you play it right, you can make it a board wipe. And then give each player a bunch of rad counters. Solid card. Very solid card. This is one of my favorite cards in this entire deck. Tato Farmer. It's a 3 cost. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you may get 2 rad counters. That may is very important. Because you can decide, you can choose. You can be like, okay, do I need more rad counters right now, or do I not want more rad counters right now? If you want more rad counters, based on your board state and where you're at, then you can acquire them. And if you don't, then you can say no. But you can tap it to put target land card in a graveyard that was milled this turn onto the battlefield under your control tapped. A graveyard. Any graveyard. Your opponent's graveyards. Your graveyard. Everything. Tap it. Put a land that was milled this turn onto the battlefield under your control. Phenomenal land ramp. Amazing land ramp. Especially in a deck that just mills everybody, including yourself. Can be very useful. In the similar vein, we got our Soul Ring, quintessential. Pay 1, tap, add 2 colorless. Here we go. Atomize, 4 cost instant, destroy target non-land permanent. Non-land permanent destructions, usually 3 or 4 cost, but this one also has the added caveat of allowing you to proliferate. Pretty solid good deal in this deck. It's black-green. Definitely a good addition in my opinion. We got Nightkin Ambusher is a 4 cost 4/4 with Ward 2. Love Ward. Love Ward so much. Anyway, 4 cost 4/4 with Ward 2. When Nightkin Ambusher enters the battlefield, target player gets 4 rad counters, so you can put that on yourself or your opponent. 4 rad counters, that's pretty darn good. Nightkin Ambusher can't be blocked as long as defending player has a rad counter. Enters the battlefield, target opponent gets 4 rad counters. If you attack with this every turn, your opponent is constantly going to be getting an additional rad counter every combat. This will not be a hard condition to hit. It's essentially a unblockable 4 cost 4/4 Ward 2 that you can build up with 1/1 counters. Beautiful card. Beautiful card. Bloatfly Swarm is a 4 cost 0/0 with flying. Enters the battlefield with 5 1/1 counters on it. Okay, so it's a 4 cost essentially base 5/5. If damage would be dealt to Bloatfly Swarm, while it has a +1/+1 counter on it, prevent that damage, remove that many 1/1 counters on it, then give each player a rad counter for each 1/1 counter removed from it. Wow. Immune to Death Touch. Fun. That's fun. Also immune to Wither. Also fun, because it prevents the damage outright. So it immune to Lifelink, immune to everything. This creature just does not get damage dealt to it. And when instead it reduces itself by that many 1/1 counters and disperses rad counters. Now, mind you, when it disperses rad counters cause non-land cards to be milled, which puts counters, right? Counters, puts counters, puts counters, puts counters, puts counters, puts counters, so on and so forth. Amazing synergy with your commander. 4 cost, very solid. Very solid card. 6 cost, 5/5, Screeching Scorch Beast. Flying Menace. Whenever it attacks, each player gets 2 rad counters. That's each player again. Hits everybody. Whenever 1 or more non-land cards are milled, you may create that many 2/2 zombie mutant creature tokens. Do this only once each turn. So it triggers once each turn. For each non-land card in this instance, you can create that many 2/2 black zombie mutant creature tokens. Right? But this is a keyword here, may. Whenever you see may, that's super important, because if you forget to trigger that, then it doesn't trigger. It's not a you must, it's a you may. But in this case, it also plays a beneficial role to you, because if, for example, let's say it's your turn, it's your upkeep, and you only have 1 rad counter and you mill and it's a non-land card. This ability triggers only once each turn, but you may trigger it. Which I believe, and I could be mistaken about this. If I am mistaken about this, let me know in the comments. I could have this backwards. But I believe that means that you can choose not to have it trigger. Yeah, no, it doesn't say this ability triggers once. It says do this only once each turn. So I'm right. So you may choose to create those tokens or not to. So if you have an instance later on in your turn where you can mill more cards than just your 1 measly rad counter, you have a higher chance of getting more non-lands and therefore more tokens, you can choose not to trigger it in that instance and then trigger it later on a different instance. And this is whenever 1 or more non-land cards are milled. So you can see what cards are being milled when you trigger this, because it specifies non-land, and you need to be able to see that in order to cause the trigger. So you'll know how many non-land cards there are before you have to choose to trigger this or not. And so you have that little bit of customization. Once per turn, you can do that. Very nice, especially with the adding rad counters on attack. Solid. Rampant Growth. Nice, simple ramp. Sorcery. Search your life. Basic land dive. Put it on the battlefield, tap, shuffle. Straightforward. Great addition. Early game mana balancing and things. Power Fist is a 2-cost equipment. With equip 2, sorry. Equip creature has trample, and whenever this creature deals combat damage to a player, put that many 1/1 counters on it. Very solid in context with this. Combat damage is going on. It's in a similar boat, honestly, as the Mega Sloth, but it also exponentially adds 1/1 counters to itself. So when it deals combat damage to a player, put that many 1/1 counters on it. So you put 1/1 counters, and then put 1/1 counters, and then put 1/1 counters on itself due to ability that it itself has. So this is more self-sustaining, in my opinion, than the Mega Sloth is. It's a 2-cost, equip 2, total of 4. Pretty straightforward. Love this card. Think it's great in this deck. We got Inspiring Call, 3-cost instant. Draw a card for each creature you control with a 1/1 counter on it. Those creatures gain indestructible until end of turn. Great synergy with this. This puts 1/1 counters on practically everything. This allows you to draw a whole bunch of cards for nice and cheap. 3 cost. Very likely that you'll have more than 3 creatures with again. More than likely you'll have more than 3 creatures with 1/1 counters on it. So you'll be drawing more cards than mana that you're putting into it usually. And they get indestructible until end of turn as an instant. So you can do this in response to being attacked. Give your creatures indestructible, block everything, draw a bunch of cards. Phenomenal. Okay, here we go. We were talking about cheaper options of Proliferate. We got the Vexing Radgull as a 2-cost 1/2 flying creature. Whenever it deals combat damage to a player, that player gets 2 rad counters. If they don't have any rad counters, otherwise Proliferate. So not only does it proliferate for cheap, but it also drops 2 rad counters on them if they're clean. Amazing card. Amazing card. You can use this card to put down so many rad counters so quickly. It's phenomenal. And while doing that, building up your own army with your 1/1 counters. Phenomenal card. Cultivate, 3 cost, another basic land dive, but you dive for 2. One enters the battlefield tapped, and the other goes into your hand. Always, always helpful. Here we go. Casualties of War. It's a 6 cost, 2 black, black, green, green sorcery. Choose 1 or more. So you choose at least one of these, but you can choose up to all of them. Destroy target enchantment. Destroy target artifact. Destroy target creature. Destroy target land. Destroy target planeswalker. Basically, destroy one of everything. That's fantastic. Destroy target artifacts, usually 2, 3 cost. Target creature, 3, 4 cost. Target enchantment, 2, 3 cost. Target land, 4, 5 cost. Target planeswalker, 3, 4 cost. All of that combined into one 6-cost enchantment. Or 6-cost sorcery. Love that card. Very good for your late game. Give you a lot of targeted control over your opponent's board state. A card like that can just turn the tide. Just snap the fingers. We got Find and Finality. Find is a 2-cost black-green sorcery. Return up to 2 target creature cards from your graveyard to your hand. Good with the self-mill. Give you a little bit of, oh, wait, I needed that. Boink, I have it back. Finality is a 6-cost sorcery. You may put 2 1/1 counters on a target creature you control, and then all creatures get -4/-4 until end of turn. Can be a pseudo low-end board wipe. And being able to put 2 1/1 counters on a creature you control can almost guarantee that whatever creature you choose will probably survive the Finality board wipe. So, absolutely, very nice card. Corpsejack Menace. Oh my goodness. So, Corpsejack Menace might be one of my favorite cards for counter decks that exist with a period on the end of that sentence. 4 cost, black, green, 4/4. If one or more 1/1 counters would be put on a creature you control, twice that many 1/1 counters are put on it instead. That doubles everything. That doubles after everything else. So, Hardened Scales, right? You got Mothman, Hardened Scales, Corpsejack Menace. So, let's say you swing with Mothman. You're going to put a 1/1 counter. Sorry. Let's say beginning of your turn, you're doing rad counters, right? Let's say you mill 3 non-land cards. So, you're going to put a 1/1 counter on each of up to 3 creatures. Hardened Scales is going to make that 2 1/1 counters. Corpsejack Menace is going to make that 4 1/1 counters. Right? And it just keeps stacking with everything else. There's a Winding Constrictor in here that does a very similar thing as Hardened Scales. So that would make it 3 1/1 counters, which would then Corpsejack would hit, and it would make it 6 1/1 counters, right? So Corpsejack Menace is just an engine card for any deck at all that runs with 1/1 counters. Super excited to see it in this deck. Totally fits. Has a place here 100%. Struggle for Project Purity. We got a 4-cost enchantment. As Struggle for Project Purity enters the battlefield, choose Brotherhood or Enclave. Brotherhood, at the beginning of your upkeep, each opponent draws a card. You draw a card for each card drawn this way. Enclave, whenever a player attacks you with one or more creatures, that player gets twice that many rad counters. In a multiplayer game, you're probably gonna want to do Brotherhood. In a single player game, probably gonna want to do Enclave. But not even necessarily, because you might want the card draw in the single player game. Notice, each opponent also draws a card. So it's more efficient to choose that one, Brotherhood, in multiplayer games, where you have multiple opponents that you can feed that off of. Where everybody else is drawing 2 cards, but you're drawing like 5 cards, or 4 cards. I mean, you know. So kind of pick and choose. Both of these options are phenomenal though, because whenever a player attacks you with one or more creatures, that player gets twice that many rad counters. So it's basically super defense. You know, people try and swing at you, they're going to end up getting rad counters, which is good for you anyway. So it works out pretty darn well. We got Branching Evolution as a 3-cost enchantment. Here's another one, similar to Hardened Scales. If one or more 1/1 counters would be put on a creature you control, twice that many 1/1 counters are put on that creature instead. So let's go back to our Corpse Jack Menace trifecta. Wise Mothman, Hardened Scales, Corpse Jack Menace, add Branching Evolution on there, and instead of putting 4, you're putting 8 1/1 counters now on 3 creatures that you control because somebody milled 3 non-land cards. And now you're just huge. You know? So, fantastic cards, those counter doublers. We got Putrefy, pretty straightforward, 3-cost black-green instant, destroy target artifact or creature. It can't be regenerated. Always helpful, get that targeted removal in there. Keep yourself clear of sticky situations and things that are preventing you from being able to run your deck. Arcane Signet, 2-cost mana rock, add 1 color of any color to your commander's color identity. Quintessential especially when you're running tricolor decks. Definitely worth it when you're having 2-color decks. You got Farseek. It's another land dive. It's a 2-cost sorcery, basic land dive. We got Contaminated Drink. Black, blue, X-cost instant. Draw X cards, and then you get half X rad counters rounded up. Good card draw in a pinch. Gives you that rad counter so that you can mill and trigger your Mothman also. Absolutely phenomenal. Inexorable Tide is a 5-cost enchantment. Whenever you cast a spell, proliferate. Like, come on. Tap, pay 4 and tap, versus whenever you cast a spell, proliferate, pay 5 once. Fantastic instance of proliferate. Winding Constrictor. Here we go. Here's another 1/1 counter doubler. We got, or not doubler, but adder. If one or more 1/1 counters would be put on an artifact or creature you control, that many +1 of each of those kinds of counters are put on it instead. But this also has an added effect. If you would get 1 or more counters, you get that many +1 of each of those counters instead as well. So this would also affect you getting rad counters, which can be helpful if you're careful with it. Mutational Advantage is a 3-cost blue-green instant. Permanents you control with counters on them gain hexproof and indestructible until end of turn. Prevent all damage that would be dealt to these permanents this turn. And Proliferate. Protection, Proliferate, 3-cost, phenomenal. This is good proliferation. You know what I mean? Does things, proliferates, 3-cost, being very much mana efficient here. Rampaging Yao Guai, green X. 2/2 creature with Vigilance and Trample. It enters the battlefield with X 1/1 counters on it. So it functions similarly to a Hydra. Some Hydras can be a lot bigger than a 2/2. That's good for that mana cost. When it enters the Vigilance and Trample, whenever it enters the battlefield, destroy any number of target artifacts and or enchantments with total mana value X or less. So it's destroy artifacts and enchantments Big creature, lots of 1/1 counters, vigilance, trample. Fantastic control card in this deck. Allows you to do a lot of different things that you want to add to your deck. You know, you got your 1/1 counters, you got your targeted removal. Just phenomenal. Agent Frank Horrigan. Here we go. Is another big 7 cost. This one I was kind of iffy with at first. 7 cost, 8/6 trample, black-green legendary. It has indestructible as long as it attacked. You know, it's great, it's great, it's great. Whenever it enters the battlefield or attacks, proliferate twice. I saw that. I was sold. I was like, oh, okay. Yeah, no, keep. Good card. Good card in this deck. You just got to make sure that you're able to get that mana ramp to get yourself up to that 7 cost. Because that, if you end up with this in your starting hand and you never get to play it, it's kind of a waste of a starting card in your hand. So there is a little bit of a risk, but the payoff is phenomenal, especially in this deck, the way that it's currently set up. I would definitely keep that card in this deck if you're just making minor modifications to it. Harold and Bob First Newmans is a 3-cost legendary creature, 3/3 with vigilance and reach. Whenever Harold and Bob die, if it was a creature, return it to the battlefield. It is an aura enchantment with enchant forest you control instead of a creature. So it stops being a creature. You just put it on top of one of your forests that you control. Enchanted forest has tap, add 3 mana of any one color. You get 2 rad counters. Harold and Bob loses all of their abilities. So Harold and Bob die, and then Harold and Bob return to the battlefield as an enchantment attached to one of your enchanting one of your forests. And then that forest gains, instead of just tap, add green, like forests normally have, it gains a secondary ability of tap, add 3 mana of any one color to your mana pool, and you get 2 rad counters when you tap it like that. Solid mana ramp involves it dying. There's minimal sack utilities in this deck. Granted, you can bash it against your opponent. I don't know. I would pull it, put something more efficient in. You getting 2 rad counters. Oh, yay, synergy, kind of a little bit. Not really, sort of. Whoop-de-doo. Yeah, I would pull that, put something a little bit more usable, a little bit more recurring, a little more easier to get to, regular, faster. But that's just me. We got Biomass Mutation is a blue-green X-cost instant. Creatures you control have base... Creatures you control, that's important to note, have base power and toughness XX until end of turn. Base power and toughness XX until end of turn. So, X-cost, XX until end of turn, but that's only the base power, and it's only creatures you control. So what this does is if this, say Mothman had 6 1/1 counters on it and was a 9/9, and we were to play this, and we were to play this for X equals 6, right? So this would, instead of being a 3/3, this would be a 6/6, and still have 9 1/1 counters on it that are added on top of that, because it's just a base power. It's not have power, but it's base power. So all the additives that would normally be stacked on top of that are still stacked on top of that. So, solid card. It's only creatures you control, which can be helpful because it's... You could also use this argumentatively that you can say opponent's creatures have base power and toughness 1/1 until end of turn. You know what I mean? And then you can do all kinds of stuff with that. But hits you. It's good for a nice general group buff, especially if you have a lot of low to the ground base creatures like this deck does. Solid choice. I would probably put something else in there instead, but definitely understand its presence in this deck. Not a bad choice by any stretch of the imagination. And we get to our last non-land card of this deck, which is the Jason Bright Glowing Prophet, which is a 3-cost, 2/3 legendary blue zombie mutant advisor. Whenever a zombie or mutant you control dies, if its power was different from its base power, draw a card. And pay 2 to sacrifice a creature and put a 1/1 counter on target creature you control. It gains flying until end of turn. With all the zombie, mutant, tribal business going on, this is great card draw. If you have a large creature that you're having trouble getting through, you can pay 2, sacrifice a creature, make that creature a little bit bigger, and give it flying, give it a better chance of getting through depending on what your opponents have. Overall, solid addition to this deck. And I think that it is pretty well well placed overall. So these are all of the non-land cards for the Wise Mothman. So I'm going to go ahead and switch over to the land cards now. I'm going to go over those briefly, and from there we can do a quick overview of the deck, and then call it there. Alright, so I was just going through the lands, and I found 2 more non-lands that got mixed in, so I'm going to go over those real quick, adding these to the main deck here. We got Vault 87, which is Forced Evolution, which is a 5-cost blue-green saga, that its phase 1 is gain control of target non-mutant creature for as long as you control Vault 87. Its phase 2 is put a 1/1 counter on target creature you control. It becomes a mutant in addition to its other types. And its phase 3 is draw cards equal to the greatest power among mutants you control. So if your opponent has a really large creature, for example, you can play this. Phase 1, gain control of that. It becomes, right? Phase 2, put a counter on it, and then it becomes a mutant, and it joins your tribal stuff going on. And then phase 3, you draw that many cards equal to the greatest power among mutants you control. Even if it's not that one, other mutants you control, whatever the case is. And power is affected by your 1/1 counters too. So, good card draw, good creature control, give you some added resources. Overall, very solid card. And then the other card that I missed was the Pharaoh Ghoul, which is a 3-cost 2/2 zombie mutant, of course, with Menace. Whenever another creature you control dies, put a 1/1 counter on Pharaoh Ghoul. But then when Pharaoh Ghoul dies, each opponent gets a number of rad counters equal to its power. Each opponent gets a number of rad counters equal to its power. Phenomenal card right there. The only downside to this card is that whenever another creature you control dies, as we already established, we only have one other real sack outlet in this deck. And so your creatures would just have to incidentally die. So we don't have a way of directly triggering this, which is okay. We just gotta keep that in mind. Maybe pull it out and put it in another deck where it would really shine and be more effective. So those were cards that I missed, but now let's go into the decks. Now, you remember this deck had 39 lands and was skewed towards black mana production, when our main deck is skewed toward needing green mana to function. So let's go ahead and look into why and how that is. I'm not actually entirely sure why, but let's look at how they actually balanced it and set it up. So first off, we've got 5 forest cards. Now, these Fallout lands have been really good with the basic lands. They've got full arts, lands on all of them. Really cool looking. But we got 5 forests. We've got, count them, there's 5 islands. We got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 swamps. Okay, so that's a total of 15 basic lands. 5 of each. Woodland Cemetery enters the battlefield tapped unless you control a swamp or a forest. I love these dual lands. They're pretty reliable. They come out untapped most of the time. Tainted Isle, so that green-black. Here's blue-black. These ones are okay. I prefer these ones to these ones, because these ones they tap for colorless, or they tap for blue or black only if you control a swamp, specifically a swamp. It's not a swamp or an island, it's just specifically a swamp. So the chances of being able to tap this for colored mana are reduced from the other one. Here we go. We got another. Here's Overflowing Basin, which is a pay 1 to tap for a blue-green. It's just a simple +1 mana and color balance converter. Fantastic land, especially in a 3-color. Here's the black-green equivalent of that exact same card, and the blue-black equivalent of that exact same card. Right? Here we got Temple of Deceit. There's another black one. This is a scry land. It enters the battlefield tapped, and then you scry 1. But it also taps for, there's black again. Here we got Sunken Hollow, which is, again, blue-black. Enters tapped unless you control 2 or more basic lands. Those ones are also pretty nice. Command Tower, taps for all of the colors. Hinterland Harbor, here's one that's not blue-black. This is the second dual land that is not blue-black, or that does not have black in it, I'm sorry, that we've come across so far. I think it's the second, maybe the third. But not very many of them, being my point. Enters the battlefield tapped unless you control a forest or an island. Fantastic. Okay, here's an Evolving Wilds. Tap, sack, dive for basic land from your library. Put it on the battlefield tapped. Shuffle your library. Right? Pretty straightforward and simple. Got a Terramorphic Expanse. Does the exact same thing. Temple of the False Gods. Taps for 2 colorless. Only if you have 5 or more lands. So that's a late game land. It doesn't really do you any good at the beginning, but it still can give you that late game ramp boost. Take you from 5 mana to 7 if you find yourself in that position. Here we got a Fetid Pools. Enters the battlefield tapped regardless, but it has cycling, so you can pay 2, discard, draw a card, if that is what you choose and need to do, based on your circumstances. Here we go. Here's our next land that does not tap for black. Temple of Mystery. Enters the battlefield tapped. Scry 1, blue-black, or blue-green. Opulent Palace. Enters tapped. Taps for all 3. Path of Ancestry. Enters the battlefield tapped. Taps for all 3 colors in your commander's identity. And when you use it to cast a creature spell that shares a creature type with your commander, insect or mutant, mutant being the key in this particular deck, then you scry 1. Ash Barrens, basic land cycling of 1, which is pretty solid. 3-color deck, that'll help you get the color balance that you need. Tap base normally to add 1 colorless, solid. Mariposa Military Base, you may have it enter the battlefield tapped. If you do, you get 2 rad counters, so you may have it enter the battlefield tapped. It's optional. If you do, you get 2 rad counters. If you don't, then you don't. So you can use that again. You may get rad counters. You can use it to regulate. If you have too many rad counters, then don't take it. Use the extra mana. If you want more rad counters, that's an option available to you. Taps for 1 colorless, and it has a secondary ability of pay 5 and tap to draw a card. This ability costs 1 less to cast for each rad counter that you have. So this can end up being tap this land to draw a card. Fantastic card. Definitely adds to the overall deck. Gives you card draw, gives you rad counters, gives you mana, gives you all of it. So, yeah, no. Very much love that land for this. Exotic Orchard. Add 1 mana of any color that a land an opponent controls could produce. In dual-colored lands, I would not recommend putting this in there. In tricolors, you're much more likely to be facing an opponent that can generate at least 1 of your mana colors. So, decent choice. I'm not sure if I would go with it, but it's a decent choice. Tainted Wood, tap for colorless. Again, only taps for colored if you control a swamp. That's important. I don't care for those lands too much. I would probably swap them out, but that's dealer's choice. So here we've got Drowned Catacombs. Enters the battlefield tapped unless you control a island or a swamp. Again, more black, more black, more black. Right? There's more black. We got tons of black here. Guess what? Mortuary Mire. Taps for black. Enters the battlefield tapped. When it enters the battlefield, you may put target creature card from your graveyard on top of your library. Your first thought might be, oh, wait, that's awesome, because rad counters. And it is. When I first was thinking about this, remember I had the mistaken view of what rad counters did. I thought that it was at the beginning of your upkeep, but it's at the beginning of your pre-combat main phase. Your upkeep takes place before your draw. So when I was looking at Mortuary Mire initially, I was seeing, oh, you put it on top of your library, and then you proceed to immediately mill it out. That's not how that works. So, Mortuary Mire, return a target creature card from your graveyard to the top of your library. Solid, except if you get milled before your draw phase or your draw step, then that card goes away. That's always been the case with Mortuary Mire. I feel like Mortuary Mire would be more efficient and safer if it went to your hand, but that's just me. I don't care too much for taking excessive risk like that, and we don't need that extra black mana. I don't know if I would keep that in the deck. We'll see. We'll see what ends up happening. Oh, more black mana. There's our black-green Scryland. Temple of Malady coming in. And our final land and card of the deck is Nesting Grounds, which is a tap add colorless, or pay 1 to tap to move a counter from a target permanent you control onto another target permanent. Activate only as a sorcery, which can be very good for moving around counters. And if you get Hardened Scales and all of those counter doublers, you get Hardened Scales, one becomes 2, one becomes 2, one becomes 2, or 4, or 8, or whatever. So that can be very beneficial to throw that in with those. And that is the complete deck list of the Wise Mothman cards. There it is, wrapped up in a bow. Now, I've played this deck a couple of times, and the first time I made the mistake of trying not to put rad counters on myself. And the second time, I made the mistake of putting all the rad counters on myself. And so I ended up with like 40 rad counters, and I just about barely milled myself out before I ended up winning the game. Just because I was playing with how the deck works, the different options that you can do with it. If you get somebody that knows what they're doing behind the helm of this deck, as is out the box, this deck is very efficient. It can be very good. Again, it's more efficient with more players. The more players that we get, each player getting rad counters from your commander, the more players that you have, the more likely you'll be to be able to trigger your commander, get you more counters out, make your creatures bigger. So you'll be more efficient in multiplayer games. I only played it in 1v1 so far. But I'm going to go ahead and say overall, I think I'm going to rebuild this deck. So each of these precons that I'm going to go through at the end, I'm going to decide whether I'm going to keep, scrap, rebuild, or integrate. And what I mean by that is I'm going to keep the deck as it is, I'm going to rebuild the deck and make serious modifications and refocusings on it. I'm going to scrap it completely, dissect it for parts, add it to the collection, it's gone, no more. Or I'm going to integrate it into one of my other pre-existing decks. This one I'm going to rebuild. I'm going to turn this, instead of being a rad counter focus, I'm going to keep some of the major rad counter cards, but I'm going to put the focus a little bit more on, instead of on being combat damage and stuff, more heavily on instance of mill. Because if I can trigger this ability here more frequently with the instances of mill, then, or the sources of mill rather, then I'll be able to put more 1/1 counters on my creatures and be able to go big and mill heavy. And so I'm going to go mill heavy, add a bunch of creatures and a bunch of things like that. I'll do another follow-up video on this for my new version of the Wise Mothman, using non-Fallout cards, just general things for my collection. And I think it'll be drastically improved, but we'll see what the spreadsheet says after that. But anyway, let me know what you think about the video. Like and subscribe for more. The next video that I'm probably going to be doing will be the upgrade of this, and then the next deck after the Mothman is completed that we're going to do is the Hail Caesar, which is the Mardu attack trigger based token drop deck. And I've got some big plans for that one as well. What I'm going to do with it after that video, but I'll go into that. Won't let you know all of the details until we actually get to the analysis on that one. But for now, take care, like and subscribe. See you next time. Thanks for watching.